Durin, Dr. Ben Thomas, Dr. Sophie Quirk from our School of Arts here at the University of Kent, joined by Deirdre Wells, OBE Chief Exec of Visit Kent. Ladies and gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Marcus and Kent Innovation, for the inspiration. And I just wanted to start off to give you a little prelude into what inspired me to put together this webinar. And it was three things. First of all, I'm working at the moment on a book about the work of a contemporary painter who has spent her life, her whole career, working with her medium in order to create an experience for her viewers that is physical, that engages us emotionally, physically, and one in which we experience our bodies differently. So as I'm researching this work, I'm thinking, what on earth happens to this work in the pandemic? The second thing that inspired me to put together this webinar was the number of cultural institutions that were saying, particularly museums, that were saying, collections are now online. And then I would go in and look at their collections, and it was an incredibly impoverished experience. And in particular, you know, questions of I couldn't get close to a work. If it was a painting behind glass, there was bad reflections. And so I was thinking, you know, it certainly has not been an easy transition online. And then the third thing that inspired me was the shutdown came in the very final weeks of semester, as those of you who are engaged with the university will know. And my students were constantly saying to me, well, how are we going to, you know, do our screenings? How are we going to do our gallery visits? Are we going to ever see each other again? And so it was this question of, yes, we've transitioned online and education is now online, but how do we have a community experience, which for me in the class is so much of what the classroom is all about. And then of course, you know, yes, we can go to the movies, yes, we can see all these fabulous films, but we can't have dinner afterwards. So my questions became, you know, what actually happens to culture when it moves online? And in the very beginnings, as you know, of the pandemic, museums, as I say, they teamed up with Google Arts and Culture, and yes, our collections are online, and musicians gave concerts, and through Facebook Live, Facebook Party, Instagram accounts, lots of film archives opened their archives to never before seen films, and this was all very exciting. Streaming platforms, there were all of these literal translation of culture online. Let's just put our cultural product online. And then of course, we all realized after a couple of months, this is not going away. And that sense of this is not going away and the fact that things have to change seems to be becoming more and more pressing, more and more urgent. As we think about things like, for example, I was reading yesterday that the Tokyo Olympics, that there is no way that the Tokyo Olympics can go ahead. All of the big cultural events for the summer have had to be cancelled. And of course, you know, the film festivals and Wimbledon and the proms and all of these events, how do we stage them? And with that sense of, oh no, this is not going away, it became clear that it wasn't enough for institutions to simply put their collections online, for example, archives to make their work available. It wasn't enough. People wanted to have the experience of being together, to have the experience of not an impoverished experience of seeing what they see in face to face, just seeing it online in their living rooms. People wanted something different. And with that, of course, came institutions needing new ways of interacting with audiences, because it became clear that museums and other cultural institutions were not going to just be able to open and go back to life as normal come the summertime, in this moment that we're in now. So there was this real demand for something new. And I included this quote, online platforms change gear. And this was a quote from a friend's Facebook page where she put up Netflix shares dropped in a single day on reports that the subscription base has not grown as massively as investors had expected. Netflix said that their main competitor was not other streaming platforms, but a gaming platform, Epic. So again, it becomes obvious that what we have is not enough. So what comes next? How do we deal with creating new material, creating new experiences for audiences, creating a new face to institutions? And I was thinking, you know, back to 1918, we've heard so much about what happened in 1918 and what lessons we can learn from 1918 and the Spanish flu. And of course, for me as a film historian, this was one of the most interesting moments, is the post-1918 moment, because this was the moment that the Hollywood film industry and the studio industry came basically arose out of the ashes. This was the moment when the Hollywood film industry was born, thanks to the Spanish flu. And of course, it was born on the back of two things, both the economic fallout and smaller theatres, etc., not being able to, closing up as a result of the Spanish flu, but also because of the new demands for creativity. This was the moment when Adolf Zucker basically stepped in, took command, bought up all of these ailing theatres and turned it into Paramount. And of course, interestingly enough, for us to think about is, you know, he basically erased women, Asian Americans, African Americans, independents. Basically, they all got cut out of the industry. So as much as we want to be inspired by the Hollywood industry and its creation of this new product in the post-Spanish flu period, we also want to take that lesson and invert it, because to me, one of the great potentials of this new moment, and I'll refer to this a little bit in a minute, is that we can change the face of the museum to become more inclusive, and cultural institutions in general, as a result of these other changes that are having to take place. To me, it's no coincidence that we have a lot of unrest, social unrest with the Black Lives Matter movement, etc., going on as well. And the two, I think, are really tightly connected. And of course, the 1920s was this moment of great artistic creativity. So I want to think about how can this moment be a time of great creative expression in the post-COVID or post-lockdown, post-confinement. Is there ever going to be a post-COVID era? I assume one day we will find a way of living without it in our daily lives. At the same time that institutions need to change, we have this artistic creativity. There are museums and institutions that have done some amazing new work because of this push to create something which is not just a replication of the in-person experience. And I've put some examples of these up. the Uffizi Gallery, which I find really interesting, you know, one of the most conservative national museums, the Uffizi in Florence has been the most creative and the most radical in its presentation of its collections online. And one of the things it's done is it hasn't simply replicated the museum online. It has these wonderful short videos of parts of the museum that you aren't ordinarily allowed into. So it's exposing parts of the collection that are otherwise kept secret. And then, of course, the big innovation that the Uffizi Gallery did, actually I shouldn't say it's the gallery, because it was a couple of curators, but what they did was they put the works to rap music, set the works to rap music and put them on TikTok. And what I think, and the link is there, and you can look at the link and the TikTok videos afterwards. But what's exciting about this is, of course, the Uffizi is using this moment in order to reach a much bigger audience, in particular a young audience. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is also a pretty conservative institution, but is doing something very interesting in that, unlike other museums that have an expert talking about, you know, just to give one example, the National Gallery in London has an expert that will talk about one painting, or other models are to have an expert online talking about a series of paintings or a temporary exhibition. What the Metropolitan does is it invites people who are not experts into the museum to talk about the works. And so there are poets and there are musicians and there are, you know, people who have an interest in the particular works but not an expertise. And they talk about what it means to them as a way to create a connection with audiences who don't want to be lectured to by an expert. And then there are, there are so many examples of institutions and groups that are doing very interesting online things. But one of the ones that I think is really wonderful is United We Stream, which over the course of the lockdown, it is a Berlin, it's a Berlin project, and they put all of the Berlin nightclubs online, and so every night you could go to a nightclub, a Berlin club, and then following the lockdown it actually became a European-wide thing. So there are all of these attempts to reinvent culture online that are taking very different tacks. The other thing that of course is going on at the same time is, if we think about somewhere like, for example, the Walker Art Gallery and its changing role. The Walker is in Minneapolis, and its changing role because of the George Floyd murder and its separation from the Minneapolis police. And so it's having a role within the community, which is not necessarily about its collection. And then, for example, the interesting, I think one of the interesting questions that's being raised is, well, it's all very well to pull down statues, but museums have a responsibility to speak to their people and create the history of the community, etc. So what is it going to do with its collections that are potentially either donated by or the possession of imperialists, racists, etc. So all of these questions come to the fore in this moment. That's why I say I think it's no coincidence that these two social events are happening at this time and affecting culture in really interesting ways. And we can talk more about this in the question time if you like. And then in the film world, there are some really interesting projects going on as well. So for example, archives around the world released work that has never been shown and is difficult, especially for Europeans to see. And I'm thinking here of an example like Women Make Movies that has a lot of independent films by women that became gradually available over the course of the lockdown. And then, for example, a platform such as Mubi, which is partnering with art cinemas around the world so that, again, there's more of a reach for these films. People are able to see films that are not necessarily available in the movies or on other platforms. Criterion.org has lifted its paywall on all films by Black filmmakers and also by white filmmakers that speak to the Black experience in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Criterion, of course, is not accessible here unless you have a VPN, which, of course, you know, every student of film will have. So there are always ways of accessing this material. Okay, and of course, and I say all of this, but there are winners and losers to the movement of culture online. And number one is, how do artists make money? Because everybody wants something for free. How do filmmakers make money? Because we all want to see films for free. And yes, there are platforms such as Patreon and PayPal and crowdfunding, and there are ways of doing it. But how many people, because of the glut of culture that is available online, how many people are going to pay in order to see something when there are many, many other options in a very crowded market? And then the question of what happens to cultural institutions, how are they going to make money when their work is being put online? How do they pay performers? And of course, you know, the question of, I mentioned the Walker before, and the Walker is a very interesting case because it's been spotlighted in the United States for the fact that it dissociates itself from the Minneapolis police. But of course, it's also letting go of its low-paid, often Black workers, and its collection is certainly could do more for its inclusivity. So those sorts of questions as well are coming up for cultural institutions. Even with reopening in some places, social distancing requirements are meaning that it's very, there's significantly reduced visitor numbers. And so there's always this question of how to keep audiences warm or hook new audiences. And then, of course, there's still the question of how we be together. How do we enjoy and be physically connected whilst dealing with social distancing and all of the repercussions of the pandemic. And the one thing, of course, that I haven't the one thing I haven't mentioned, there's much I haven't mentioned, but you know, there are also big corporations out there that are making the most of this moment. And I'm thinking of the recent Comcast launching of Peacock, which is this hyper-conglomerate streaming service, which is, again, a big money-making service. So there are all sorts of divisions within the market, the paying market, the non-paying market, the question of, you know, who has access to what, and I think Sophie's going to speak more about that. Another question we want to think about is, it's all very well having everything online and having everything available, but often, you know, it can be a dumbing down, a contracting, a 10-minute read, you know, so how do we encourage people to continue to use the technology in order to expand our minds rather than continually contracting knowledge. And as I say, Sophie will talk more about access for everyone. And then, yeah, so what I'm going to do now is I am going to turn it over to Ben, who is Ben Thomas, who's a reader in history of art and has done some online curating with our history of art students and is himself an established curator. And then Sophie is going to talk more about the challenges and opportunities for live performances and events. And I should say that Sophie is a senior lecturer in drama, and her work is specifically related to comic and popular performance. And then Deirdre will, from Visit Kent, will extend the discussion into tourism and visiting heritage. So again, just to reiterate Marcus's point, if you put your questions in the chat as they come up, and then we can address them when the presentations are over. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Ben.
So I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about a curating project that I was doing with my MA students at Kent just as the pandemic hit. They were getting close to realizing a physical exhibition, which is called Once Upon a Time and Now, which had to turn into an online exhibition at very short notice. And I really want to sort of commend and praise my students for the amazing job they did in turning that round very rapidly and from the four corners of the world, really, because the students came from Italy, China, and Portugal, and they all went back to be with their families once the pandemic started. So it really has been an online experience. And you can visit it at the web address there, onceuponatimandnow.com. Now, as often happens when you're teaching curating at postgraduate level, you get a wonderful idea emerging from basically two contradictory ideas, or what seemed at first like contradictory ideas, which was that there was an archaeology graduate who very much wanted to do something about the Egyptians, and a fine arts graduate who really wanted to do something about feminist art. And so what we did was we put those two ideas together and came up with the idea of an exhibition about the ancient Egyptian goddess Isis and her influence on contemporary feminist art, which is surprisingly pervasive. And the starting point was this little amulet in the Beanie Institute in Canterbury, which is roughly the size that you're probably seeing it if you're looking at this on a laptop. If you've got a large desktop, then you're probably seeing it larger than it really is, which is really just to introduce one of the key points about curating online, which is physical scale tends to get messed up a bit and flattened by the online experience. So this is basically something that could be worn. It's not a monumental piece of sculpture. Of course, what we didn't know at the time when we started developing this exhibition was that Isis is also the goddess of healing, among other things, and so is a very appropriate goddess for our particular dilemma. I think it's worth looking at in briefly because although as I say, I thought the students reacted really commendably to the challenge, it does highlight some of the problems of trying to translate a physical experience to a digital experience. So moving on, this is the home page. And you can see there that there's an embedded sound clip that you can activate. These are all screenshots, but if you go to the website, you can play around with this yourself. And that sound clip reproduces the sound of this metronome in a work by the contemporary artist Nicole Wassel, which is called Equality. And this was selected because the pyramidal shape of the metronome and the gilding of the surface, the artist intends a reference to ancient Egyptian culture. And the slow ticking of the metronome is the slow wait for women's equality to develop and be realized. Now, this piece perhaps suffered less from translation than others in the exhibition because it's a conceptual piece and because we could embed a short film that the artist had made herself of the work. So if you click on that arrow, you'll get to see the metronome ticking. Other works didn't translate quite as successfully. I mean, from the point of view of curating, this was perhaps the most exciting loan that the students secured. It's a prototype for a very well-known feminist artwork, Mary Kelly's Postpartum Project, where Kelly is documenting the development of speech in her son and his enculturation and all of the sort of gender ideas that come with that in a series of tablets that are extraordinarily rich in terms of the layers, the layering of technique, where the work is also referenced in the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum, which is how we were able to decipher the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt. And so hence the inclusion of this work in the exhibition. So it's a real coup to get this. But unfortunately, you can't see all of it on a laptop. So you have to scroll up and down and you get this very approximate sense of the work. Also, we had to make do at short notice by using a sort of homemade photograph taken by the collector who owns this work. So what we're seeing is not ideal in that it is framed and there is a perspex lid over the top of it, which is throwing up some reflections and shadows. So not absolutely perfect and not a full translation. In order to give viewers of the online exhibition some sense of what the relative scale and the spatial arrangement of the works were intended to be in Kent's Studio Free Gallery, which is a 144 square metre white cube space, which you can see here mocked up in a 3D recreation. So one of the things we all had to learn a lot very quickly about online technology or buy in the expertise where we weren't able to. And this is an Italian designer called Rossella Pirone, who made these wonderful mock-ups of the exhibition for us. And you can just see Nicole Wassal's metronome in the right foreground there, and get a sense of how some of the works that we'd borrowed were actually very large, like the Anna Maria Pacheco painting that you see behind it, which shows Isis reviving her dead husband Osiris in a modern version of that myth. And other works on the far left, a Nancy Sparrow print, which we only knew from quite a bad photograph. And so there were some important details for the interpretation of the work that we only realized quite late in the day. So although this goes some way to giving you a sense of the physical arrangement of the objects in space, and I always say to my students that an exhibition is the realization of an argument in a spatial form. You can't really get in there and move around and feel how one work is speaking to another across the space. So it's a partial translation, and I think it throws up as many questions as it answers problems. So reflecting on this experience, I asked the students to come up with some of the pros and cons of the digital versus the physical version, and there were some pros. A digital exhibition is not constrained by the physical dimensions of the gallery. If we'd known it was going to be online, we could have had more artists, more works, a wider range of artists, because we were constrained by transport costs, for example. I mean, I'd encouraged the students to include Egyptian artists. It seemed wrong to have an exhibition about Egypt without asking Egyptian artists to participate. But it was going to cost quite a lot to ship their work from Egypt. So those physical constraints aren't there. The exhibition also came in under budget, as there were no transport or framing costs, and we didn't need to insure the works. There was a higher footfall. The students, having got the exhibition up, there's a tendency to, with a digital output, to think it doesn't really exist, and then you lose enthusiasm for promoting it. And that was a bit of a struggle over the early summer months to get the marketing going and the advertising. But in the last month or so, we've had as many as 15,000 visits to the website. From initially, it's sitting there on about 50 for about a month. So learning how you have to keep promoting a digital product and think about that differently was something that we learned together. Arguably, there's a greater integration of the exhibition with supporting events and better connections with external sites. So you can download the catalogue. We learnt how to use InDesign, and there's an online catalogue which you can download. But you can also go to YouTube videos by the artists from links in the website. And there may be a longer legacy for the exhibition through the website and the downloadable catalogue, and a more diffused impact. The exhibition will last for about 2 years instead of 1 month. On the downside, as we've seen, some major loans were effectively lost, like the Mary Kelly. And the sense of scale, the address to the beholder, the material quality of different techniques, all these things get flattened and reduced in an online form. And I guess what I took from this was that it's simply not possible to translate those aspects of a cultural event or an artwork which require on the physical presence of the beholder. So those spatial and temporal dimensions of an exhibition were flattened by being online, despite the best efforts of our excellent designer. And perhaps there's less of a sense of community. We may have reached more people, but perhaps their experience was less intense than if the exhibition had been in the Jarman building on the Canterbury campus, and there'd been repeat visits and a sense of people talking about it and it sort of permeating their life as exhibitions on campus can do. And then there were also some technical difficulties, which there were a lot of them. Apparently our exhibition was very vulnerable to hacking, which none of us thought about. And so there had to be some thought put into that. And also, it's going to look very different on a phone than on a computer screen. And that, again, there are 2 versions of the exhibition. You can either view it on your phone or on a computer screen, and I don't know which is better. But we had to think about that, because most of the people looking at it probably are going to look at it through their phones. So this was a huge learning curve for me as well as for the students. And then during lockdown, I found myself in the Italian Cultural Institute in London, where my partner Katya is the director. And a very, very sharp transition to doing things online, where they were very, very much doing things in the Institute. And you had a returning audience who were very loyal to the Institute. And they simply can't reopen at the moment because the cleaning costs are the main impediment. So this is a screenshot from an exhibition that I did at very short notice for the Institute, using the format of their website, where the text is shorter than I might have written for a catalogue, and the links to the main elements of the exhibition are embedded into the text. I chose this because the artist is a friend of mine, Paul Caldwell, and he'd created a piece that was specifically digital. It was a digital piece, and it was about longing to travel and about the passing of time, so it seemed appropriate. And it didn't suffer from translating to a digital format. And here you can see a screenshot from the Vimeo channel of the Institute, where on the right you can see Paul's first orders, in which he has juxtaposed an architectural model from Sir John Soane's collection in the Sir John Soane Museum in London. And below you can see him impersonating Soane's servants in the kitchen while they try and create their own models from vegetables and from sugar cubes and other materials. It's a lovely work, and I would encourage you to have a look at it. It's still online. And then Paul also made a short 5-minute talk using the PowerPoint ability to do a sort of talk over a PowerPoint display. I'm going to end now with a screenshot of the Paul Mellon Centre in London, which I think was already starting to think a lot about these issues of online delivery in a very creative way, and are doing it very well. And it's really just to reflect on how, after the pandemic, we can add a dimension to our cultural experience by maintaining a sort of hybrid physical and digital experience. Perhaps curators have been guilty of just using the digital as a sort of marketing tool for a physical event. And I think that events are going to have to be more hybrid. They will be physical, they will be live streamed, and they will be archived in a digital format as well. So thank you, Frances, back to you.
Thank you, Ben. That was really interesting, and I've got some questions which I'll ask in the later section. Sophie, would you like to take over now?
Alrighty, so I'm talking mainly about live performance, which I think is obviously going through some very significant challenges, with this being one of the things that you really can't we can't expect to soon have large numbers of people gathering together in the way that they did. So I think an important thing to note about the way that all of this is interacting with COVID and lockdown is that the idea of live performance becoming an online resource was already something that was happening, and that had its kind of controversies and ways that it worked and ways that it didn't. So that first image there is of the National Theatre, and of course the National Theatre exists for the purpose of people being able to come together for what will feel like a really big night out, because it's a big cultural institution. You're going out to South Bank and all the rest of it, and you're likely to be going to see quite a major work if you go there. However, sometimes there is debate about whether a national theatre has any business having a single location at all, because wherever you were to put a national theatre, many citizens of the nation would have to travel a very long way to be there. This national theatre is in an expensive area of the country, where if you want to eat or drink anything, if you need to stay overnight because it's a long way to travel back after a late show, you're going to incur costs that are absolutely prohibitive for a lot of people. And then, you know, you've got childcare issues, or paying for care cover if you're a carer who's having to go out, and all those sorts of things. So one response to some of that is the live screening that the National Theatre does. So it live streams to cinemas, it does replays of recorded work in cinemas, and of course something that people got really excited about at the beginning of lockdown was that they were going to be streaming for free to people's homes via YouTube. So I had friends who were getting dressed up to go to the theatre and sitting in their living room watching big shows on YouTube. But all of this has always had been attended by some of the debates that Francis and Ben have already raised. So that experience is sometimes described as being impoverished. You aren't able to be together and breathe the same air with the actors and the audience. Someone else is deciding exactly what you're seeing. So a camera angle can give you a close-up of one actor's face, when you would in a theatre be able to choose whether you're looking directly at that person's face, whether you're seeing it in the context of also there's a stagehand in the corner, and all those sorts of things. Some people have complained about not being able to see properly scene changes. They enjoy watching the work of stagehands, and those things are getting kind of elided by recorded work. So for all that it makes theatre more accessible, there was already a debate around, okay, are we actually just opening up an impoverished experience to people rather than creating a theatre that people that really enables as many citizens as possible to be going and seeing it, given that it is the National Theatre. To have a look at a second example, this is the Stand in Edinburgh. This is primarily a stand-up comedy venue, and it's one of very few purpose-built spaces that are really designed just to be putting stand-up comedy on. So what you might notice about this space, one of the reasons it's really loved, is that it adheres to all of the things that a comedian is looking for from a comedy space. It's bright and busy. That's actually something about how your brain interacts with the idea of laughing. If you're in a bright and busy space, that really helps. It is a space that actually can house a reasonably large audience, but feels very small and crammed. They can push you to the front and section off the room so that it always feels kind of busy. You'll see the stage there is tiny and people are really kind of crammed in around it. This is in Edinburgh, so to get there it's steep, to get down the stairs into the venue is steep, to get to the stairs to the toilets is steep, everything is steep. People familiar with the city will feel the pain of us who are interacting with it on a regular basis. So that is all the things that traditionally we think comedy audiences really like, but this is also a set of things that can be quite prohibitive in terms of people engaging with it. I'm personally someone who's happy to sit in the front row of a comedy show, but most comedy nights fill up from the back precisely because a lot of people find that quite a threatening environment. And actually one of these small spaces or these spaces that feel very intimate, where people are surveyed all the time, where you're crammed in together, these can be spaces that lots of people don't like to go in at all or feel very nervous about going into. And also the Stand does its best to be an accessible venue in terms of people with impairments in their mobility, but the fact is it's not seamless. If you want to go there as somebody who needs a toilet on the same floor, for example, who needs help to access the building, then they ask you if possible to give them notice in advance because you're using the backstage toilets, because you're going to need a staff member to help you get into the building, and all those sorts of things. And that's not to mention that all of these theatrical spaces, any space for a live event, has a pretty complex system going on of inviting some people in and implicitly excluding others, whether they intend to or not. So, for example, for large traditional theatres, there are all kinds of schemes that pop up aimed at trying to get free tickets to, for example, young people or to people of colour, because it's noted that audiences in those demographics don't feel invited in. With comedy, there's a very big debate about comedy being heavily classed in the way that audiences access it. So audiences of different classes in kind of different social environments feeling that they are or are not invited to comedy events, and that being something that really heavily influences who is likely to come or not come to your event. So in principle, the live streaming of comedy really ought to make it much more accessible, and the same goes for all kinds of theatre, that there's a real opportunity here if we're developing really good online platforms, and theatre makers being wonderfully ambitious and innovative people, that is going on everywhere. There should be some really brilliant opportunities to draw more people in, to make things more accessible to audiences, and also to performers who might also have challenges about accessing venues. And I think in the wider context of this summer, and Black Lives Matter is the most obvious but not the only movement that's sort of pushing for this, we're being encouraged to consider that the old power structures that we may have had, the old systems of who is included or excluded, really aren't assumptions that we can hold to. These things just aren't good enough anymore. So, for example, Black, Indigenous and people of colour theatre makers have produced a really comprehensive and detailed list of demands aimed at the white American theatre industry, titled "We See You, White American Theatre," and that ranges from very practical things like your costume department should have people who have both the products and expertise to work with black skin and black hair, for example, that you should be making diverse hires from the boardroom downwards, and that work that is by or tells the story of people of colour should be both positioned and promoted as mainstream work, not just kind of put off into the side venue and treated as if it was a minority interest a kind of event. In terms of the live comedy industry as well, we've seen basically the problems come home to roost of having an industry that was very inequitable in the way that it paid people. So actually comedy is a really significant industry in the UK. It's a 500 million a year industry because it has a very successful commercial top end. But actually, all of its live activities are really hard to make money out of. As Francis noted, people have a lot of free online content. There's an expectation about free online content. So comedians find it very hard, and other people involved in making comedy find it really hard to actually monetize those online activities, which have really kind of exploded since lockdown. And because what you had there was an industry where the top tier were earning a huge amount of money, but it rested on some really unfair, impoverished working practices where people were rarely paid on time. There was a lot of favours going on, a lot of people performing for free in order to try and get better opportunity later on, and a lot of people living very close to the line of what they could afford. We, according to the live comedy industry, who made a survey in people working in the comedy industry, we have a third of venues already thinking they're facing closure. 10% of artists and other workers in the comedy industry say they have already left to seek other employment, and nearly 60% are predicting an exit by February 2021. So the challenges of trying to keep that big industry in place are enormous, and actually all of those other kind of identity factors, all of those inequalities that we knew were already at play, are absolutely coming out in that survey as well, with gender, race, class, geographical location, caring responsibilities. All of those are risk factors to make it more likely that you're going to be one of those that has to leave. We could also think about the way that art is typically funded. So some of us at Kent are involved in a campaign to try and get comedy recognised as art. And that's a really pressing concern when we have a comedy industry that will need some access to the government support that has been announced and has no mechanism for getting it, given that institutions like the Arts Council, who are likely to be distributing some of this £1.57 billion that the government is going to put into supporting arts and culture, typically organisations like the Arts Council have a very patchy record in terms of recognising anything like what you can see the comedian Mark Watson doing in the picture there as actually being a valued artwork and not just a commercial endeavour, despite the fact that a lot of this commercial endeavour loses a lot of money. So I think this summer, with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, with also the comedy industry in particular having a resurgence of its own #MeToo kind of moment, this is, like Francis was saying, of 1918, it's a moment of opportunity where we know we have to do things differently, and we're looking for really good ways of doing them differently. But the challenges are really significant, and there are still lots of questions that we need to find answers to. So my final image here is of the Gulbenkian Theatre. This is the main house of the theatre that is on the University of Kent campus. That is a theatre that usually seats 340 people, and actually just outside the door there is a cafe bar which normally runs a second stage, so has a smaller capacity for kind of shows that have cheaper tickets. Into this space, the Gulbenkian are now saying they will be able, when they are able to reopen, they'll have a capacity of 120, so something like a third. There will be no second stage because they will need all of the space in the bar to socially distance, and we can expect that they're going to take a hit in terms of bar sales and restaurant sales as well, at the same time as trying to manage some of those new adaptations that Ben was mentioning, cleaning costs, physical adaptations to the space. So there are some big questions raised by this if we're going to make the most of these opportunities. Whose responsibility is it to pay for any of this? Is it for the government, for arts funders? Can punters possibly be expected to be able to pay 3 times and more what the ticket was going to cost? Although I'm really interested to note that Ben's mentioning some economic gains, which I think might be really interesting to pick up on when we discuss all of this. Another question is there a way of monetising some of these online alternatives in a context where punters expect online content to actually be free? And with high pressure on funding, is this just going to reassert the old inequalities with the old institutions, the old bastions of power getting the lion's share of that money? Or can this moment in which funding really has to be allocated carefully also be used to redress some of those inequalities? So those are my questions. I look forward to coming back to them with all of you when we get to chat, and I'm going to hand back over to Frances.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was really wonderful. And I'm now going to invite Deirdre to come and talk to us about heritage tourism, Visit Kent.
Thanks very much, Frances. Just fascinated to hear the presentations from colleagues. What I'm going to talk about a little bit, and I was really particularly interested to hear that conversation about inclusivity. Obviously, I come from a position where, you know, when you run a destination, you really want people to come and visit the destination. We've been doing loads of work online as well, and highlighting some of the fantastic work that our colleagues have been doing across the cultural sector. But I think that absolutely we are moving to a new phase now where how people now start to interact with destinations, with our cultural institutions is going to be very different, and we need to be ready for that. But I'm going to start with giving you some kind of context about, you know, the relationship between culture and tourism, which has been very strong probably since the days of the Grand Tour. And particularly to focus on the culture in Kent. So generally speaking, culture is a huge draw for tourists. So 40% of all visitors will say they will choose a destination just on the basis of its culture. And we've already always known that culture was a huge draw in Kent. We already do very well as a destination. Before the pandemic, we would expect about 65 million visitors every year, and they bring about £4 billion to the economy. And we've always known that our heritage is a huge draw. But a few years ago in 2017, we undertook some research to really to delve into that. And what we heard was that our architecture, our heritage is by far and away the biggest draw, followed by our performing arts, but also our food and wider cultural offer. So culture is incredibly important to our visitor economy in Kent, and something that I think we've been very proud of and spending quite a lot of time investing in. I just wanted to pick on a couple of examples of the sort of projects and activity that has been particularly impactful from a visitor economy perspective. The first is a project that we are working with. It's jointly funded by Visit England and by the Arts Council, and it's called England's Creative Coast. So it is a combination of a series of commissions which will be rolled out across the southeast coast, so involving Margate, also Sussex, Southend. There will be 5 major public artworks. Sadly, they were all supposed to be starting in April this year, and of course we were right in the middle of the pandemic and that couldn't happen. On the positive side, we have now got another year in order to be able to really engage with communities, with the artists, and with the destinations in which these pieces of work will find themselves. And I think one of the things that's been quite interesting during the pandemic is an opportunity to use the all of that excellent work that's happening online, particularly from the artists themselves, to be able to create some excitement in the run-up to the launching of the first, or revealing of the first artwork next year. The other thing it's enabled us to do is to nurture another part of the project, which is around art homes. And this is a new project which is encouraging artists to open up their properties and to either have visitors stay there or to conduct experiences within their property. Now, you might imagine that for many artists, they don't really see themselves as being part of the visitor economy or the tourism industry. So this delay in the rollout of this project will give us an opportunity to really work with artists to say, actually, there is a huge market of people coming and seeing art at a close hand, to having those experiences. And of course, now we're going to have to do it all in a very socially distanced way. But certainly it's an opportunity to marry some trends that we've been seeing over many years, that people really want to have experiences. They're not just content to passively engage with culture or engage with the destination. So being able to marry those together will be really important. The other thing about, of course, those great artworks that are outdoors is, it's a very inclusive way of delivering culture. And we've seen huge success, particularly for those areas that maybe have got demographics that aren't, the traditional cultural audiences. So to be able to use the opportunity of, that online engagement, but also the public spaces in which these artworks find themselves will be really important, I suppose, to really push those issues around inclusivity that we talked about earlier. I can't really talk about culture and Kent without talking about Margate and the Turner Prize. And of course, what a Turner Prize we had, and thank goodness we managed to get that done and dusted before lockdown happened. So just a few stats that you may have seen, which is the Turner Prize in 2019 was terrifically successful, and actually was the second most visited Turner Prize in its history. So fantastic result for Margate, great profile for us. And of course, the fact that we had a controversial decision meant that we got huge amounts of TV coverage. And as I said to some colleagues who were a bit worried about whether or not we really needed one winner, I said, well, if there had been one winner, we wouldn't have had the Today programme back on Margate Beach the next morning, still talking about the controversy of the prize. So all publicity was good publicity, was my view. But of course, it's not just about the exhibition itself or the prize itself. It's about all the work that Margate now are doing in and around the exhibition. And for us as a visitor economy, a third of everybody who came to see it stayed overnight in the area, and that means that we are getting that ancillary spend, that support for the wider ecology of the destination that is so important, particularly for a destination like Margate. And again, back to this point about inclusivity, it was fantastic to see that a quarter of all visitors were from the local area, and being able to engage people with those local stories is really critical. And as the Turner now reopens this week, being able to engage local communities with the stories of the exhibition, I think, are going to be really key. And I'd also like to pay tribute to Turner Contemporary, because they also have done a huge amount during lockdown to put a lot of their content online. And I think it all helps to be able to remove those barriers for people not to think this is not something that's for me, that actually it's something I can engage with, something I can understand, and also something that I will be familiar with when I actually can visit in person. But a lot of our culture in activity in Kent is really linked to major events, of course. So whether it's Estuary 2020, whether it's the Folkestone Triennial, and of course the upcoming bid to be City of Culture 2025. The big issue, of course, with events is that many of them were planned this year and have had to be postponed. But I think as we now move into a new phase when some of those events will be permitted and albeit held in a very different way, it will be really important to, I suppose, re-emphasize their importance to focus local communities and visitors on particular activities that will be a draw to the destination. Certainly, there is a call to action in marketing speak around events, and particularly for a destination like Kent, which is very ancient. Very straightforwardly, Leeds Castle has been here for 900 years. If I go next weekend or the weekend after, does it really matter? And it's really important that we have these cultural events that say, well, if you don't come this week, you're going to miss this exhibition or you're going to miss that performance. So culture and events will be always really important to get people to come and spend now. But I just wanted to widen it out a little bit because I think there is a danger where you can almost sort of pigeonhole people or vulture hole people in terms of that people who are interested in looking at culture, that's all they're interested in doing, that's what the focus is, and you need to just talk to them about culture. But of course they are people and they are visiting and they've got it in the way, a destination in the way that everybody else is visiting, and they're also have a wide variety of interests in the way that everybody else does too. So I wanted to share with you some of the wider consumer sentiment we are getting at the moment about how visitors are feeling, whether they're visiting a theme park or an attraction or a museum or a gallery or a beach at the moment, how people are feeling. The good news is that 20% of people who are generally those minded to visit things have already been. So the minute the beaches opened, the minute the Turner opened, they were back. They are the early adopters, people who are pretty confident. The worrying thing is that 50% of us are still feeling a bit twitchy about going out anywhere. It will not surprise you to know that indoor is making people more nervous than outdoor. And I think, you know, for institutions to be thinking about how they can adapt their offer, not only to go online, but actually to go outdoors will be really key. People want reassurance, and the Visit England Good to Go mark, which many of our cultural organisations have also adopted, is seen as very reassuring. It's seen as kind of gold standard of that the institution has made sure it's complying with all the COVID secure guidance, that its staff have been trained well, and that it will be okay when they get there. The big worry is always about other people, less about how institutions will roll out the guidance, but how other people will behave. Interestingly, aligned to that, 2/3 said they would feel more confident to visit if the wearing of masks was compulsory. And I think this is something I think we'll have seen since the new laws came in about shopping, that actually almost going above and beyond what maybe perhaps feels necessary can really reassure those 50% who are still feeling quite nervous. Interestingly, that people are starting to expect a full offer. So they want, if they're going to go somewhere, they really want to know that everything's going to be open, that they can access what they're normally expecting to access. And those who've seen me speak before will remember that I'm slightly obsessed with the 3 T's, and culture vultures are the same as everybody else. What they're worrying about is tea, toilets, and tech. So will the loos be open? Will they be COVID secure? And the same for food and beverage. Will I be able to get something to eat? How will it be? And the tech bit, I think, plays very nicely into some of the online activity that our institutions have been doing. So 98% of people, before they travel to an attraction or a museum or gallery or a theatre, will be looking online. They'll be looking to see what's on, what's open. It's a fantastic way, particularly for those institutions that have done very well with engaging new online audiences, not only to talk about the content of your program, but actually to talk about how your venue is going to feel when you get there. So what will the staff be wearing? Are they doing visors? Are they doing masks? You know, what's the offer going to be? What are the expectations on you as a visitor? And to be able to engage the audience in a way that perhaps not only reassures them, but also manages expectations. Because I think it's really, really important to remember that, you know, although people are predominantly coming to venues for the culture, that actually what they will be looking for is an opportunity to have a great meal with friends afterwards, you know, somewhere to sleep, and how are they going to get there, and how are they going to travel? And that's probably the unsocially distanced form of transport that there's ever been, but we may get back to that at some point. So culture will always be a really, really important part of what we do. And I would say that as part of that, we need to be collaborating with other organizations. So cultural organizations need to be best friends with the local hotel, with the local restaurant. And likewise, that ecosystem is really important, because one of the first questions that customers are asking is, what else is open? So, you know, it's not just about the hotel they're going to, or the pub that they're visiting, or the cultural institution they're visiting. They want to know what else is open. So the best thing you can do is a bit of cross-marketing, a bit of knowledge about what's in the area around your venue, to be able to ensure that you keep people for longer and spending more. So culture will always be a really important part of the offer in Kent. You know, we are so much about the heritage, so much about the fantastic new vibrant culture that is growing up all the time. And as those new creative industries, like the fantastic new development at Ashford, you know, all of those arrive, we will be doing this in new and innovative ways. I think the last few months have been phenomenally challenging for our sector, but they have also brought new and exciting ways of delivering culture, of delivering our destination to hopefully lots of new audiences to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. You make me want to visit Kent. It was really wonderful. So what I thought I'd do is I'll get the sort of the questions moving, and then people in the audience, if you would like to, I see we have one question, but if others would like to post their question in the chat, please go ahead now while I get while we sort of start the discussion going. I think there's so much coming up from each of the presentations, and I think I'm going to start off with outdoors. One of the things that I was thinking, Sophie, as you were performing, is something that Deirdre brought up somewhat in passing, though, is the possibility of having theatre outdoors and moving outdoors for health reasons and social distancing reasons. Is that something that theatre makers and the theatre institutions have been considering, or for some reason it's not on the agenda?
Yeah, it's absolutely on the agenda. Lots of theatres, particularly small producers, are really thinking about it. Live comedy gigs, for example, are starting to move outside, and obviously there's lots of context in which live performance works really beautifully outside. Music festivals are absolutely hinged on the idea that people are going to perform music outside. I remember once seeing a wonderful open air Macbeth where it was all performed in front of this one massive oak tree, and it started on a sunny, delightful evening. And then as that play progressed and got darker, the night got darker, the wind picked up, the tree became full of crows. It was just the most amazing outdoor experience. I think the challenges for moving, as we're having to at the moment, thinking about moving everything outside, and also being distanced, are that lots of what we what we appreciate or have traditionally thought we appreciate about theatre is the feeling of being close together. And actually theatre architecture tends to support the idea of making people feel very enclosed and keeping the energy in. So if you think about something, a reaction like laughter, if the ceiling is low, the walls are tight in, and that laugh has to bounce around between people, there aren't gaps between people, it is much easier to get an audience laughing. Same's true of gasping and all kinds of other reactions. So the real worry for lots of theatre makers is that if you're not only outdoors but also distanced, you're going to start finding it harder to engage the emotion. So the danger is not that the experience can't happen, but that it's again impoverished in a kind of similar way.
That's so interesting. And someone has, El has written, in Bedfordshire there have been drive-in air shows being organised. Drive-ins is another thing, are another phenomenon I know that have sprung up in the United States. Is there any discussion in the UK, either in theatre or in Kent, theatre or Kent, like the two are separate, to have drive-in, you know, because of course it's this really novel, exciting way to do something completely different but still have that cultural experience. Is there any discussion?
Yeah, the drive-in is back, Francis. I'm quite excited about it. I feel like, you know, it's an opportunity to be in your own personal Grease movie. There is so many of them around. We've got a whole feature on our website about ways to do local drive-in. Really, really exciting, I suppose, new development. I absolutely take Sophie's point, though, about that sense of one of the things that comes up, not just about in our, for our cultural institutions, but even from our pubs, about how do you create atmosphere in a socially distanced way in a place where you can't have background music and all the rest of it. And I think that loss of atmosphere is the thing that's going to worry people most. But at the moment, what we've got to try and do is get people doing stuff, because they've been in their houses for such a long time that even getting to a drive-in or going to a socially distanced theatre experience is a lot better than what we've had before. So as people start getting more comfortable, then I think we'll see a lot more footfall, and I have no doubt that people will become even more and more innovative in terms of how they deliver it in an engaging way.
And also, just, I mean, it's interesting. So I live in Paris, and our museums are open, and I have to say, it has never been more of a joy to be back in the museums because of the social distancing. You know, I went to a museum, the Musée André Jacquemart last week, which is, it's an old house, and it's typically filled with people from the neighborhood. A lot of retirees, pensioners, etc., and they crowd in together in these tiny little rooms. And it was a Turner exhibition, and I was really sort of, you know, I said to my friend who I said, look, if it's too stressful, we're leaving. It was absolute joy from beginning to end. I have never enjoyed it more. We had the timed tickets. Masks are compulsory. Everyone, you know, there were only ever 2 or 3 people in a room, in these small rooms. And you know, so there we were with these masterpieces, you know, alone. It was absolutely wonderful. And of course, I don't know what that means for museums, because of it. It means, of course, there are less people coming in at any one time, but getting the word out about what a pleasure it is to be experiencing culture and engaging with culture in these different circumstances seems to me also to be something important. You know, doing a visitor online surveys, or, you know, getting the word out, it seems to me to be something which is really important, because I've spoken to a lot of friends who are just not doing it. They're like, cinema, I'm not going to the cinema. And of course there's so few people there, it's just joy from beginning to end.
I think that's a really interesting point, Francis, that for some of us, and I probably count myself as one of those people as well, actually having a bit of space and avoiding a crowd is absolutely a kind of advantage of the lockdown. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom about theatre, because I think actually you can you can have the same sort of experience of space and just being there with your own loved ones in an open air theatre environment as well. I was really interested in Deirdre's point that actually what people want is some reassurance before they get there. So if they can look up online and know what the expectations on them are going to be and how it's going to be handled, that you feel more comfortable going anywhere on that basis.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I mean, here it's very different, of course, because it's government issued, or it's a centralized state, so it's all sort of laid out in advance and everything, but it's so meticulously done that it's effortless for the visitor. At least for me it was. Other places, you know, shops, I find it a little more stressful because even though it's masked, you know, there's the line outside, there's the people who don't, they're all in masks, but they don't obey the social distancing. You know, it's shops I find more stressful, restaurants more stressful, but the cultural institutions, fantastic. Because there's no food involved, maybe. Another thing that Deirdre, do you want to, just for people who don't know the story, you referenced the controversy around the Turner exhibition, and do you want to just explain, because I just think it's really interesting that it did coincide with COVID, although it was beforehand, and of course that it was at the Turner Contemporary as opposed to the Tate Britain, which is where it's always been every other year. Is that right?
It used to be at the Tate Britain every year, and then there was a decision, I used to work at DCMS many years ago, that it would move during the year of Capital Culture to that destination. So it went to Liverpool, but now there is it alternates between London and a regional venue. So it doesn't have to be linked to Capital Culture. So yes, for those who've been living under a rock, what happened this year was instead of having a winner, the 4 finalists decided to join as a collective so that they couldn't compete with each other. And they made a statement about it was actually more a post-Brexit almost a statement about, in a time when both in the UK and also in the States, that there is that the society feels very polarized, that they were making a statement about artists and culture being a force for people coming together. So the whole night was really interesting because many of you have been to Turner Contemporary. It's a fantastic space, but you're not going to fit 300 people in for a swanky dinner and lots of cameras. And so that bit was hosted by Dreamland. And the bit where the dinner was held was, and I'm sure they would forgive me saying this, slightly gritty. So it was the most fantastic space. It was slightly felt like it was still under construction or had been, but they had the most amazing dinner. We had deconstructed fish and chips, if I recall it, very posh and very nice and very Margate. And the whole event was brilliant because it felt edgy, it felt quite cool. And the controversy, as I said, really helped because we had camera crews in Margate for several days. And I think it gave us an opportunity to be able to tell some stories about the cultural transformation that Margate's gone through, and the opportunity and the power of culture to do that, but also the fact that, newsflash, BBC, there is great culture outside the M25. And I think the more we could do to keep emphasizing that, the better. And we definitely had the sort of audience arriving down from London for that event that we don't typically get in Kent, I have to say. It was quite an interesting and eclectic mix of people who I think had a fantastic evening.
Right, so yeah, interesting. Thanks, Deirdre. I'm just going to go there. So there's a question here from Richard Longman. What about the amateur scene as well as professional in performing arts sectors? Economically, this is modest but critical for some jobs, tutors, directors, conductors, coaches, but vastly important for participants' well-being. For performing arts, mass participation looks very uncertain for a long time to come. And I just want to add to that, the other side of the story, of course, is also those people who have really been able to exploit the situation and really develop a product that sells well in this particular climate. Sophie?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to talk quite positively about, quite rightly trying to talk quite positively about things opening up and solutions here. I think we've also got to acknowledge that this situation is heartbreaking for lots of people for lots of reasons. And I think one of those is absolutely the amateur and community performing arts scene. If you think about the growth of rock choirs, or them coming more to people's awareness over the last few years, the kind of Strictly Come Dancing, causing people to go out and join dance groups and things. It's a really important part of lots of people's social life, and to think that people have that cut off is a really, really heartbreaking thing. So I just want to firstly acknowledge that there's something really heartbreaking going on there. In terms of how we can get the amateur scene started back up, I guess there's no definite answer to that, but I suppose some of the solutions that are working for professional theatre are going to work on the amateur level as well, and are going to trickle through. If you are able to access an open air space, one of the other difficulties, of course, of open air performance is that overheads don't have to be, but can be higher. So you don't necessarily have a space that's easily adaptable. But yeah, I think that is a really good point that Richard raises there, that we, as I was mentioning about the comedy industry, we have a performing arts industry that relies on a base layer of people who are working for free or unpaid. So for lots of jobs, that's a significant part of what you do. And because we had that unbalance, that inequality already, we were set up like that. This is all those problems coming home to roost. So yeah, I don't have a solution to that one, I'm afraid, but it's a really important point, both because of people's emotional connection to those things, and because it speaks to a kind of industry that needs to get its finances a bit better balanced, I think.
TikTok?
Which of TikTok's many wonders do you think can help?
I'm also thinking of all of the amateur performances that have been that have kind of risen up or come to the fore in this period on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook Live, and people really using those platforms as a way to reach vast audiences.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that has kind of blossomed under lockdown. I think already artists were feeling the pressure to engage with those things. So, and in some instances, whether they wanted to or not, on the whole, people who I speak to about producing that kind of online content really enjoy doing it. Generally, people tell me they have very little idea about how it's received. You might think being able to see likes racking up and that kind of thing would mean that it gives people quite a good sense of how people are interacting with it. But often the sense I get back, particularly from independent artists, is I put this out here because I like it. I don't really know how anyone else responds to it. So there's a kind of, I think the two kind of issues. So it's difficult to monetize. It's difficult to, it's more a way of engaging and building an audience than actually producing the work you want to produce, if what you are is a live performer. And then I guess, yeah, it's difficult for people to know quite how it's been received. So actually, in terms of, lots of performers are talking about the impact on their mental health of trying to put their work out into a void, and not really, even if they're doing an online gig, you can't hear the responses, you can't feel the atmosphere coming back at you in the same way. And people are finding that really difficult to navigate. Their identity has always been hooked up in having these kind of experiences where they're getting something back from an audience, and it's so innovating to kind of put it out there without it coming back.
So it's creating a kind of schizophrenia. I want to go to a question from Alice Alice May in Baltimore, and maybe Ben, well, actually everyone, Ben and Deirdre. thinking about, I mean, this is the question, isn't it? Is thinking about how technology can homogenize artistic media by resizing pieces to the same and to be a 2D image, which seems to be one issue. But the issue, I think, is that the question that Alice raises, which is really interesting, is how will the move to digital create another gap of accessibility between those who can afford to have internet, phones, computers, technology, and those who can't? And you know, it's a good question. I mean, is the Italian Cultural Institute doing anything to create hotspots or to reach out, I guess, to audiences that don't necessarily have internet access? And also for Deirdre.
Well, yes, the internet creates issues around access that intersect in some ways and are different to physical events. An organisation like the Italian Cultural Institute has free events, so the main cost for audience members is getting to central London. Studio Free Gallery in Canterbury, which is our gallery, is free. So if you're a resident of Canterbury, you can just walk onto campus and come and see it. And so ultimately what this boils down to is how are the arts funded, which is an issue that Sophie's raised around comedy being recognised as an art form. And certainly from the point of view of a museum, exhibitions are largely, from one point of view, well, they're cultural events, but they're also income generating events as well. It's been very important for Turner in Margate that it was free, and it's being, funded by Kent County Council. And that is I think, very important. I've also been thinking about this issue around access to culture because art history and the visual arts are sometimes, I think, unfairly seen as rather exclusive art forms, and that it only appeals to people with money. And there are some interesting experiments. Leeds Art Gallery had, I think it's still running, a very good scheme where you could literally borrow a work from the collection. So if it was in the reserve collection, it was with your library ticket. You could pay an extra £30 or whatever it was when you registered at the local library, and that was your share in an insurance scheme that meant that you could have an Atkinson Grimshaw at home if you wanted one, and you could live with it like a library book. And I've been trying to think of things like, citizens art clubs, where in Canterbury we have, in the university, we have the Kent Print Collection, which is a collection where, by teaching a course about collecting and curating, students buy an artwork for the university, so they feel really invested in the art collection. And I would like to see, quite radical schemes like citizens arts clubs, where because you jointly own the art, you can take it home and live with it. And I don't see that the response to the pandemic needs to be that everything is digital, because yes, not everyone can afford a really good phone where the image quality is high enough to. And we found this with students, with having to go online overnight in teaching, that there are students who will send you emails saying, I can't access JSTOR because I don't have internet access where I am. Oh, I'm having problems submitting my essay online. So equally, mass tourism, as Francis, you've been experiencing, can create access problems. Just getting to a local collection. Because if the gallery is full of tourists, you're not really seeing the art anyway. So there are always going to be these issues. I don't think it's either digital or physical. I think it's more to do with the politics of arts funding, really.
It's interesting, and it also raises the raises the point, I think, that so much is culturally specific, because I wonder, Alice mentions that she's from Baltimore, and I just wonder whether or not the issues, I mean, yes, there is some crossover, but I wonder whether or not the issues are culturally specific. I mean, one of the issues, more than the internet connection for me, was students who didn't have privacy, or that they were sharing a computer, and that meant that it was impossible for them to do whatever it was, whatever the exercise was. And I imagine, you know, going around art museums and having an online experience is something that would also be connected to access to the technology, not just the internet connection.
Francis, is also a really interesting point. I think relates to this on the chat from Stephen. Is the gallery somewhere a person of my type feels welcome visiting? Even it's projected the idea that galleries and museums not there for us, and what alternative venues you could use to display would be things like cafes. I wondered if Ben just had. I'd be really interested to hear if you have a response to that, Ben.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that there is a sense of it's not for the likes of us, to use a sort of English idiom, which is that what curators refer to this as threshold anxiety, that you can have a free exhibition on the high street and people still won't come through the door. And why won't they come through the door? It's not that they're not interested, but there's something inhibiting about the way that culture is presented, that it's seen as having a prestige or an elite aspect to it. And, you know, like a lot of my career as an art historian has been trying to challenge these assumptions that art history is just for middle-class people who can afford to go to Florence on their holidays. Because it isn't. I mean, if the pandemic is showing us anything, there's a real need for culture, you know, whether it's literature or the visual arts or comedy or whatever it is. People are beginning to feel that this is, as I think it is, a human right, that we should all have access to culture. And sure, if that means exhibitions and cafes, and I'm all in favor of that, but I think they should be as good as the exhibition that you might see at the National Gallery. And that's what and that's not to criticize. I've seen some great exhibitions in cafes, but typically it tends to be emerging artists who are trying to sell their work. Why can't you see a Gerhard Richter in your local cafe? And I'd like to see a world in which that became more normal. I mean, certainly one of the great joys of being in central London during the lockdown is I can go around and look at Rodin's and Henry Moore's, which are just in the street. And that's normal with sculpture. So in some ways, sculpture is like the most democratic art form there is, if you're fortunate enough to live in a city where there's good sculpture on display. There's some terrible stuff as well in London. I mean, awful, but you just need to walk down Park Lane to see that. But yes, I do really would like really to see a diversification of different venues and different types of, and yeah, for people to be able to live with art is something I would be an ambition for me, that you could take it home for a month or two and live with it.
So that's so interesting, but I completely agree about sculpture as a really democratic form of art. But I guess the flip side of that is that you end up with this situation where you have a summer where lots of statues are being torn down. So it's this sort of problem of we'd say sometimes that, you know, democracy being imperfect, and certainly things that come about through the majority voice will marginalise minorities.
Yes, when I said terrible sculpture, I meant aesthetically, but the debate about the politics of sculpture is also interesting, and who gets to decide that a statue goes up, of course, is historically very interesting, and why certain people are commemorated, or why a particular artist is selected and who gets to choose that is very interesting. And I think that involving the whole community in these decisions is something that we need to try and do more of. I mean, it's often a bit opaque to people why a statue suddenly appears on their high street. I mean, who made that decision? Why was that artist chosen? It's not always obvious. But yes, I think people should get involved, and they should not necessarily break the law or anything, but what those actions have shown is how important culture is in our public spaces.
Just to sort of pick up to go back to Kent, you don't need to be in London to see great contemporary sculpture, as Deirdre showed us. You can go to Margate and see it. See the famous Anthony Gormley statues. Okay. So I was going to actually ask Deirdre about the Artists' Home project, the Artists' Homes project, because one of the, as you may know, the arts building at the university is named after Derek Jarman, and we have this relationship with Jarman and the Jarman legacy. And, we were very excited to see that Prospect Cottage was saved. And I was just wondering, was Kent involved, was Visit Kent involved in that at all? Because I know it was publicly funded.
Well, we didn't support it financially, but we have been supporting it sort of morally, I suppose. It was fantastic news, and we do a lot of lobbying, I think, on behalf of the sort of cultural assets of the county. I mean, I think I was really interested in also hearing what Ben was talking about in terms of that threshold anxiety. Because I think, I'm old enough to remember I was at DCMS when their new Labour government came in and abolished museum charges, and it was such a seminal moment for the sector, and has become, I think, this holy grail of culture should be free, but it still, I think, hasn't really addressed the participation in the way that I think we all hoped it would at the time, and I think whatever we can do to make our culture accessible, and maybe this moment of not only it being virtual, but that opportunity to do more stuff outdoors will almost, if we eliminate the threshold, will we be able to support people to engage in a way that perhaps they couldn't in the previous time? Is that the big change that's going to happen after this pandemic? Like the movies took a leap forward after Spanish flu, but I think, I always feel it's one of the biggest duties you can do as a parent is to take your kid to look at art, because all of the indications are that if children do it when they're young, they will in turn take their kids in years to come, and it eliminates that whole "this is not for me" feeling, which so many people, sadly, as many people have said on the chat, still feel. So I think this is really, an incredibly challenging time, but it could also be quite an exciting time in terms of pushing away some of those barriers that perhaps still persist despite all the best efforts to get rid of them.
So there's a little sort of thread that's been running through here. So sorry if I'm not picking up the individuals who have mentioned it, but there are people kind of talking about actually the opportunities that COVID and lockdown have opened up to engage people. So the issue of people launching themselves on TikTok, having a larger number of attendees able to come, which Ben can obviously speak to with his experience of getting 15,000. Ben, did I get that figure right? Yeah. So getting very sort of large numbers of people through. So actually, I guess what all of that speaks to is that there are opportunities here to engage audiences in different ways to engage people who wouldn't have been there otherwise. And actually, as someone who was talking about, do we need to rearrange the economic model of the arts, some of this thing about people being able to launch themselves on TikTok, being able to attract larger, and I think we're talking about paying punters to a gig online, might actually be a way that we start getting some of that money flowing to the people who have traditionally been marginalised or have had sort of difficulty making the fee for a gig, say, cover the distance that they have to travel with a cello on their back and all the rest of it. So I wonder whether the panel sort of thinks that there are these kind of opportunities really to engage people in new ways, and also for artists to find remuneration in different ways.
You know, I keep coming back to what you were saying about Arts Council being the distributor of the government quote unquote bailout for the arts. Is that right? That how much of that, because to me, so much of it is about decentralizing support for the arts and the recognition of art and culture, not just the great cultural institutions. How much of it goes through the Arts Council, and how much of it, like, how is that money distributed?
The answer is I don't know. Somebody who's here might be able to post us some more information on the chat, so if there's anyone who can do that, then do. What the work that a bunch of us are doing around trying to get comedy recognised as art, so that's those of us who are involved with some of the comedy research organisations, also people who are involved with the British Society of Aesthetics are trying to do, is around the fact that when that announcement was made, it was unclear how it was going to be distributed. I think it remains unclear how it's going to be distributed, and the Arts Council was one of the organisations name checked. But I don't want to demonise the Arts Council in particular. They have funded the odd comedy project, usually where they're talking about doing relaxed performances or something for children or for audiences who aren't usually engaged with the arts. And I think really the anxiety about comedy in particular, but I think it goes for other forms of popular performance as well, not getting funded, comes from the idea that we have still a very kind of hierarchical idea of what counts as good culture, and that things that don't easily translate across the idea of good culture are going of highbrow culture are going to be left out, no matter how you distribute this money, because we are in the first instance having to explain to people that comedy is a craft. So take comedy as an example, it's not the only thing that's affected by this. So if you're having to start by explaining that comedy is a craft, that it takes time to learn, that Michael McIntyre did not emerge from the womb able to do what he does for a very large amount of money, and that he had to have environments where he learned his craft. And actually, he got himself into really significant and crippling debt before he ever made the sort of money that he does now out of comedy. If you're having to sort of explain those things, and you're having to cajole people into recognising comedy as art, then there's a real concern that it's going to be left to the crafter itself. So comedy, live music performance, those have been seen as things that have that are very cheap to stage and therefore very easy to make money off. And that myth has been allowed to get to a point where something like this hits and people really are falling out of the bottom of the industry, and all the diversity is falling out of the bottom of the industry as well.
So it's about value, which of course then comes back to Ben's point about, taking artwork home. Well, we're not going to be taking the Rokeby Venus home, and putting it on our wall. So it's like about how do we, it's about de-hierarchizing cultural value as well, and what we value, and then someone also had written in the chat about, so it was Natalie from Kent Creative, talking about the arts organisations that are producing quality work outside of Margate and Turner Contemporary. Again, I think Kent, I think Turner Contemporary, I think Margate, I think Leeds Castle, I think Derek Jarman's house. I think, there's these sort of hot spots, if you like, these foci of good valued culture, whereas it's about de-hierarchizing that and embracing culture of different kinds and putting it all on the playing field is another level. Like that works at every, you know. And as you're talking, Sophie, I'm thinking, I know this is no solution. Well, it is a solution, but it's like vote Labour. You know, it's like while we have a government that is distributing money in this way and making these kinds of decisions. Because the other thing, of course, that comes up for me that I think of when you say that is, well, then we need to educate, you know, that's about education, and it's about boosting the education in the arts, and of course that's why we need to vote Labour. You know, because when the arts is being defunded and education is being defunded, and it's a very negative thought. So wanting to Ben, go ahead.
Well, I guess with one of my other hats on, I've only just recently stopped doing this, but I've been for years a trustee for the Association for Art History. And one of the arguments that we've been, I think, reasonably successfully getting across to government is that although an academic discipline like art history may not have a clear and immediate economic outcome, it's hugely important to the economy, as all the other arts are. You know, if somebody goes to see an exhibition, they're going to spend money in a restaurant, they might stay in a hotel, and so on and so on. The knock-on benefit of having a vibrant art sector and supporting people in doing that, not necessarily through direct funding from the centre, I don't know if that's necessarily the answer, but just that there's a recognition from all political parties that the arts are critical for our economic life as well as our social and cultural life. That would be a big breakthrough. I think that, and I think that there is, for some people who aren't directly involved in the arts world, there's a tendency to think of it as a bit like a hobby. And, you know, that's nice, you like art, but why should I pay my taxes to fund you in your hobby? And that's an understandable point of view if your hobby is golf or fishing rather than going to arts events. But it's because it has got an economic impact as well. I mean, I'm thinking back to the 80s when the then Conservative government brought in a scheme called the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which was for unemployed people who were given a little bit more unemployment benefits in order to encourage them to start up their own businesses. And I think when the government started that scheme, they had in mind people who might become, I don't know, window cleaners or that sort of small business model. But actually it led to a cultural renaissance in England in the 1980s. A lot of people I knew were writing a novel or had started a theatre company or were in a band, and they were able to get on this scheme. And I think the police were on, you know, the band The Police were on this scheme. And so, you know, we got the police because of it. Whether that's a good thing or not, it depends on your taste in rock music. But yeah, it's something that needs to be recognised as a cultural and an economic good, and we need to find ways of making sure it doesn't collapse during the pandemic, because that would impoverish us literally as well as culturally.
Deirdre, did you want to?
Well, I'm straying way out of my brief, but you know, I suppose for me, culture is the ultimate tool in levelling up. You know, whether, you know, and you need to be able to give people access to great art is one of the huge joys of living in a country as rich as this. And, you know, I think, you know, we need to be using all the mechanisms that we can to be able to continue to deliver our culture to as many people as possible. But I also think whether it's participation in schools, and I've got a vested interest. I'm a trustee of a youth music charity, and it's just so transformative for children. But it's still, there is a real danger that it's the preserve of the middle class. And I think, as Sophie was talking about earlier, about the amateur sector is so vital, because I think it provides that sort of social glue for many people. But also, I think, whether it's mental health or even physical health, I think the opportunity to participate in culture is so valuable. And I think whatever we can do politically, socially, to just keep shouting about the value. I mean, one of the jobs that I've got is shouting about its economic value, because depending on the colour of the government, they tend to listen more or less to the art for art's sake argument. But actually, if we can ensure that socially the argument is made, politically the argument is made, artistically the argument is made, but from my perspective, economically the argument is made that investing in culture and access to culture is really invaluable to this country, I think the more we can do that collectively, the better.
And as Natalie just from Kent Creative just wrote in the chat, that's why small organisations are also really important, because they have that sort of reach as well. On that note, unless anyone has any final comments, questions, I think we might wrap up and move into the networking event. Let's join forces. Yes, join forces. I mean, I also think that is the answer as well, is, as Deirdre said at the end of her presentation, we need to all be working together, because if stronger together. So thank you all so much for your participation. This has been really interesting and fun and informative, and I hope that those on the line, the other participants on the line, a lot of people have left now, but have also found it interesting and invaluable. And anyone who can, please do stick around for the networking.
Thank you to all four of you. That was a tremendous discussion, and it was great to see as well real audience participation there, and some all those questions throughout. So thank you again to all of you.